Hey guys, welcome back to another Global Politics revision video. Today we're going to be going through civil society, NGOs, and protests, which is all a part of Topic 1, Power and International Relations, specifically framing global politics. So, civil society refers to organized groups or communities that are independent of the government, working towards common goals, often aiming to challenge existing problems or create change. The characteristics of civil society are they operate independently from the government, work on common goals such as social issues, may challenge existing attitudes or beliefs, and can include NGOs, cultural institutions, charitable organizations, etc. They play a role in holding governments accountable, promoting public freedoms and transparency, responding to crisis, and advocating for policy changes in human rights. And they work towards ending poverty and inequality, promoting justice and accountability, protecting the environment, and fighting against discrimination and corporate irresponsibility. Now, I want you guys to try and think of a real-world example of civil society and their role. The example I came up with is Greenpeace. Greenpeace is an environmental NGO that works globally to protect the environment. It campaigns against environmental destruction, promotes sustainability, and pressures governments and corporations to adopt eco-friendly policies. Next, speaking of NGOs, we're going to be focusing on that now. So NGOs, as I'm sure you know, stands for non-governmental organizations. These are organizations independent of government influence, most commonly non-profit, working towards social, environmental, cultural, or political objectives. There are four main types of NGOs. So the first one is charitable NGOs, which focus on meeting the needs of the vulnerable, alleviating suffering in disaster areas. The next one is service NGOs, which provide essential services such as education and healthcare by offering opportunities. The next one is participatory NGOs, which engage communities in projects to help themselves, enabling community-driven environments and development. And the final one is empowering NGOs, which aim to empower the people by helping them to understand and claim their rights by advocating for social justice and human rights. There are three levels of impacts on politics that NGOs have. So the first smallest impact is the local level. NGOs can influence local policies, community practices, and social norms. So this is usually within a city or, for example, in the United States, within a state. The next level is the national level. So NGOs may advocate for legislation or national policy changes. This would be within the entire country. And the next one, which affects everyone, is international level. NGOs often influence global policies, trade agreements, or international human rights law, which affects all the countries. Now I want you guys to try and think of a different NGO example. The example I came up with is a really famous NGO called Amnesty International. Their mission is dedicated to safeguarding human rights globally by opposing violations and advocating for justice. They shape global human rights policies, offer legal support to vulnerable individuals, raise public awareness on key human rights concerns, and hold governments accountable to international standards, which is a very important thing. And this is a good example of an international level impact. Next, we're going to be focusing on different types of protests. So the first type of protest is a social movement. These are protest movements organized by groups of people to express dissent or advocate for a change, often in response to perceived injustices or governmental actions. They typically involve public demonstrations, marches, and other forms of activism. So as you can see, these are not violent. They aim to raise awareness about certain issues and influence public opinions to pressure the government to implement change. Their role in politics is influencing public decisions by using the media and drawing attention to an issue. This is to make the government want to change something. And then their impacts are that they can lead to policy changes or implementations, but they can also result in political instability. They are a threat to power as they challenge legitimacy and actions of those in power, which is seen as a threat. One notable example of a social movement is Black Lives Matter. This particularly affected Minnesota in the United States, as chokeholds there were banned and body cams were required for police. Although it had international media attention and awareness, these changes did not affect all of the US or other countries, so it was therefore mostly a subnational impact. The next type of protest is a resistance movement. This is an organization who are resisting against the government for specific laws or policies. They use nonviolent ways, but sometimes may resort to violence. They aim to challenge a policy and the government to pressure them to implement change. They want an overthrow and a change of power. They act as a force of opposition, often engaging in direct action to confront current authority and governments and influence political change. Their impacts can lead to collapse of oppressive regimes, but they can also lead to prolonged conflict. They are seen as a threat to power, and actually direct threats because they challenge legitimacy and want to overthrow the government. An example of a resistance movement is the Arab Spring. This movement aimed to overthrow oppressive regimes and demand political, economic, and social reforms. The next one is violent protest movement. So violent protest movements use force or armed conflict to achieve political, social, or ideological goals, often arising from extreme dissatisfaction with the government or social conditions. They aim to challenge or overthrow the government using radical and violent ways to gain autonomy, control, and power. So this is clearly the worst one. They create political tension and can lead to prolonged conflict, may influence governmental decisions, or may gain power and control territory. They force governments to address an issue and the people and can lead to negotiations and reforms. However, they do often lead to violence, instability, and human rights violations. They are a huge threat to power as they pose a threat to government stability and control and may overthrow them and take over. One example of a violent protest movement is FARC or FARC. This evolved into one of the most powerful and violent insurgent groups in Latin America, funded by illegal activities like kidnapping, extortion, and drug trafficking. The conflict with the Colombian government lasted over 50 years, which is a huge example of how we can see violent protest movements can prolong conflict. Thanks for watching.